Utnapishtim recounts the story of the flood in chapter 5. This was originally an independent story that was incorporated into the Epic of Gilgamesh at some point. There's an old Sumerian version where Utnapishtim is named Siosudra, meaning he saw life. In the old Babylonian version, Utnapishtim is called Atrasis, which means extra wise. The name Utnapishtim is the Akkadian version, which follows the Sumerian version. He saw life, or he found life. The striking parallels to the biblical account of the flood have been noted many times. There can be no doubt that this was a widespread myth throughout the Near East, and thus it's no wonder that it was appropriated by different peoples in different traditions. It will be recalled that the patriarch Abraham came from the Sumerian city of Ur. He thus would have been familiar with the Sumerian mythology and was presumably raised in it. The author explains the reason for the great flood at the outset. Human beings had multiplied greatly, and they caused a lot of noise which irritated the gods. Quote, "In those days the world teemed, the people multiplied, the world bellowed like a wild bull. And the great God was aroused by the clamor. Enlil heard the clamor and said to the gods in council, 'The uproar of mankind is intolerable, and sleep is no longer possible by reason of the babel.' So the gods agreed to exterminate mankind." End quote. Here again we see an example of the childish, impetuous, and generally unsympathetic side of the Mesopotamian gods. They decide to kill the entire human race simply because they make too much noise. Surely one would think that they could find some less radical expedient to the problem. In the version in Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 to 7, the situation is in some ways similar. God regrets that he has made humans and decides to exterminate them with a flood. But the difference is that in the Bible, God's motivation is that humans have become sinful and wicked, and not simply that they're making too much noise. Note also that the use of the word Babel, which evokes the image of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, which occurs immediately after the flood story in Genesis. Strangely, there's a similar motif in the Mayan myth, the Popol Vuh, where it's recounted that Hunahpu and his brother made too much noise when playing ball and thus angered the gods of the underworld, the lords of Zabalba. The gods thus tricked them, pretending to encourage them to continue playing, but then decapitating them with a bladed ball. Here as well, the gods are disturbed by the fact that humans make too much noise and are determined to destroy them by a ruse. In Gilgamesh, the god Ea, behind the back of Enlil, warns Utnapishtim of the coming danger and instructs him to build a boat in order to save himself and his family. Utnapishtim is concerned that people will ask him what he's doing, and when he destroys his house and builds a boat, and asks Ea what he should say. The god advises him to lie. Quote, "Tell them this, I have learnt that Enlil is wrathful against me. I dare no longer walk in his land nor live in his city. I will go down to the gulf to dwell with Ea, my lord." End quote. The goal of the deception here is to reassure the rest of the people that everything is fine and that it's only Utnapishtim himself who has fallen into divine disfavor and must leave. But it will be noted that there's an ambiguity in the language of the lie proposed by Ea. The point is that the people will be blessed with fish, birds, and grains, but the language used is couched in terms of a metaphor of a flood. Quote, "But on you he will rain down abundance, rare fish and shy wild fowl, a rich harvest tide. In the evening, the rider of the storm will bring you wheat in torrents." End quote. Thus there's some hidden truth in the words about the true flood to come. Like Noah, Utnapishtim makes a large boat in accordance with the god's directions. He then loads it with his family and all of the animals, quote, "both wild and tame." A series of different gods led by Adad, the lord of the storm, create the flood and its devastating consequences. The flood is so frightening that the gods themselves come to regret their decision. Quote, even the gods were terrified at the flood. They fled to the highest heaven, the firmament of Anu. They crouched against the walls, cowering like curs. The great gods of heaven and hell wept. They covered their mouths. This is an instructive passage for understanding the Mesopotamians' relations to their gods. In what other religious tradition would the people conceive of their gods as, quote, cowering like curs? This is striking and shocking, but also revealing. It shows that there's a degree of animosity between the people and their deities. This is also in evidence in Gilgamesh's rebuff of Ishtar and Enkidu's insulting her. The gods are to be appeased and venerated in a sense, but they're also disdained. This is perfectly in line with perhaps the main motif of the story, Gilgamesh's dissatisfaction with the common lot of humanity, death. He can't understand or accept that the gods have made humans mortal. For this, they're the object of anger and envy, since they are immortal, although they have condemned humans to death. This is a master and servant relation, where the servant always secretly resents and hates the master. Here, the resentment and hatred is quite overt. One might argue that there is, to some degree, a natural feature of polytheism, where there are a number of different gods with different interests and alliances. There will always be some that certain people find sympathetic and others that they won't. Thus, while Gilgamesh has a negative relation to Ishtar, he has a positive relation to Shamash, who's always spoken of in positive, reverent tones. But in fact, it goes deeper than this, since in the passage quoted, all of the gods are collectively described negatively. There is a general dissatisfaction with the gods and their creation of the world order. After the storm has passed, Utnapishtim, again, like Noah, lets out birds one at a time, and when one does not come back, infers that there must be dry land nearby. He ends up apparently landing his boat on a mountaintop, where he immediately proceeds to make a sacrifice to the gods. He burns sweet-smelling materials that rise to the gods in heaven. Quote, when the gods smelled the sweet savor, they gathered like flies over the sacrifice, end quote. The simile of flies is hardly flattering to the gods. This emphasizes yet another oddity of these divinities. They're dominated not by reason, love, or the highest human qualities, but by the lowest, the passions, the senses, etc. One recalls Ishtar's demands for sex, or Enlil's anger at the noise made by the humans. Again, this is strikingly different from the conception of the divine in other traditions. Usually the gods are thought to exist in a sphere of heaven where things are unchanging, in contrast to the mundane sphere. But by contrast, these gods are fickle and act like spoiled children with no mature rational faculty to check their desires and passions. They decree to destroy humanity with the flood, but then come to regret it. The bickering of the gods continues. They enjoy the burnt offerings, but Ishtar says that Enlil should not be allowed to join in since he was the cause of the flood. When Enlil realizes that a human being has escaped the flood, he falls into an angry fit and quarrels with Ea. In the end, Enlil repents and makes Utnapishtim immortal. This is the upshot of the whole account of the story of the flood and the point that Gilgamesh is ultimately interested in. Utnapishtim explains, quote, then Enlil went into the boat. He took me by the hand and my wife and made us enter the boat and kneel down on either side. He, standing between us, touched our foreheads to bless us, saying, in time past Utnapishtim was a mortal man. Henceforth he and his wife shall live in the distance at the mouth of the rivers, unquote. Thus he became immortal. So Utnapishtim and his wife represent special exceptions to the fate of mortals, but this is no help to Gilgamesh. There's an implication that after this, no one else can be made immortal since the times have changed. This is reflected in Genesis in that the pre-Diluvian figures are said to have lived in probably long lives, whereas after the flood, human lifespans become more normalized. So also the Sumerian kings list names antediluvian kings having lived extraordinarily long reigns in contrast to those after the flood. This also makes for an interesting contrast to the story of Genesis. Noah remains entirely human. His family begins the line of patriarchs, but their reward is wholly of this world. No one is granted immortality. God makes his covenant with them in order to protect them. For the Mesopotamians, there's no covenant and no enduring protection. They must be constantly vigilant to remain on the good side of the gods and hope for the best. Theirs is a world dominated by contingency and anxiety.